Have you been told that the Grand Canyon and the Ice Age are things that prove that the Earth is billions of years old? We're going to study that today on The Truth in Love, so stay with us.
There's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. It will give them courage new, it will help them to be true. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out.
Ring out,
merrily ring
the word,
speeding away,
Lord,
message divine,
and see,
send it today,
still far from Jesus, many live in sin.
lost and those in doubt, darkness and doubt.
I want to thank you for joining us today on The Truth in Love. We're continuing our series of lessons on Christian evidences and matters that relate to the existence of God and the creation of the earth and the universe. Brad Harrop is with us, as he has been throughout this series. And Brad is qualified to deal with these matters. He holds a PhD degree in anatomy and neurobiology and goes around the world lecturing on these kinds of topics. And we have enjoyed you being here, Brad, so much. We're glad you're here.
Good to be here.
We've been discussing in the last few programs matters relating to the age of the earth and how the numbers that scientists give us are numbers that, first of all, don't square with what the scriptures teach. And then on our last program, we talked about all of the scientific data, the scientific evidence that points not to an old earth, but to a young earth. And one of the things that stood out in something that Brad talked about on our last program was how that there are some 27 methods that are used to date the earth, and only 3 of them show an old earth, but we don't hear about those. We only hear about, or those are the only ones that we do hear about that show the old earth. We don't hear about the mountains of evidence that show it to be young. And so we didn't quite finish, Brad, with what we had intended to do with the last program, so we're going to kind of continue with that.
Okay.
And as I mentioned in the tease, a lot of people believe that the Grand Canyon and the different layers that are there can only be explained by millions of years of erosion, and then the Ice Age as well. So we're going to talk about both of those topics, but let's take them one at a time. Let's talk about the Grand Canyon first.
The Grand Canyon is a great evidence for a young Earth, even though a lot of evolutionists would probably gasp at that. The common story that young people are told is that a river cut that gorge over millions of years. Scientifically, we know today that it doesn't take millions of years for water to cut a gorge like that. In fact, there are 2 gorges in the United States that occurred in less than a month. Very similar in look and appearance to the Grand Canyon, not quite as big, but obviously if they can happen in less than a month, you think about what could happen with, say, a global flood in a much shorter amount of time. A couple of things to think about when you think about the Grand Canyon itself. If that river really did cut the gorge, we have to ask the question, where is all the dirt that allegedly came out of that was cut away? You know, the answer, if you've been there, you know that it's nowhere near the canyon. A better explanation was that it was washed out quickly and that dirt is literally all over the United States. Another thing to think about is we know today there are striatal layers, those different colored layers that are on top that actually, according to evolutionist dating methods, are older than ones on the bottom. So you have an upside down geologic column, something that definitely shouldn't be there. I think everybody can probably picture all of those different color striatal layers, and one of the things that we just touched on briefly last time was the presence of polystrate fossils. That is, fossils that transcend through 2, 3, 4 of those different layers. Now, if we have fossilized trees that go through 3 or 4 of these different layers, the question is, if you're a dead tree, you're in a particular layer, you're going to just sit there while millions of years different sediments collect around you, or are you going to decay and rot? And the answer obviously is you would decay and rot. But we do have these fossils. So an explanation is needed. We turn to science and all of a sudden we realize, hey, there is an explanation. the explanation we found recently just on the side of Mount St. Helens. There's a lake called Spirit Lake, a lake in which most of the trees on one side of that particular mountain were washed into when that particular volcano exploded. A friend of mine, Steve Austin, who is a creation scientist, he went to observe some of the things that were going on, how quickly the Mount St. Helens area was coming back to life. He actually put on a wetsuit, took a dive down into Spirit Lake, and he noticed that the logs would float for many, many days. And then they would slowly tilt over, usually root side first, bob up and down for several days before finally slowly settling in. But he noticed at the bottom of Spirit Lake there's what looks to appear to be a forest. They're actually standing uprightly as the sediment slowly settles down according to weight. You see, what we see going on right now in Spirit Lake is explaining to us how those polystrate fossils really could have, in fact, appeared on this earth. A global flood explains it very well. Those polystrate fossils, fossils that would transcend through 3 or 4 of those Grand Canyon layers, are proof positive that it didn't take millions and millions of years to form.
In scientific circles, you talked on the last program about uniformity, as we were talking about radiometric dating, and that's one of the things that scientists, not only do they need a lot of time, but they need that as well.
That's right.
And they won't, many of them refuse to take into consideration, unless they're forced to, what they call in science catastrophism.
That's right.
And which would be things like volcanic eruptions and things of that sort. And one of the greatest catastrophes that can explain and does explain a lot of the things that we see is what you've been referencing, and that has to do with the flood.
Yep, and when we look at mountaintops all over the planet, whether it be in the continental United States or whether it be in Asia, we find marine fossils on the tops of all of these different mountains. Now, you may be able to get away with saying that it was a local flood once or twice, but when you find that kind of evidence all over the planet, that particular excuse of just a local flood begins to wear very thin.
Yeah, let's get into the flood a little bit, because it has some bearing on some other things that we're taught about the land. We're talking about the Grand Canyon and how that was formed. There are other land issues in the earth that when I was going to school were explained by evolutionary processes. The land bridge that was supposed to have existed, between Alaska and the Asian continent, the concept of Pangea.
Yes.
We're told that it takes billions of years for all that to work itself out to where we have what we have today. But catastrophism could explain that too.
Very much so. I think everybody can relate to a period of time that our teachers called the Ice Age, and oftentimes textbooks would have images of woolly mammoths or saber-toothed tigers telling us about a time period that allegedly happened millions of years ago. Another explanation, when you look at the Ice Age scientifically, another explanation may be what Eddie was talking about, and that is a catastrophe. The first thing we need to define is, was there actually an ice age? And that one's pretty easy, Eddie. We were up in Alaska. We were able to see some glaciers up there, Exit Glacier. There's very little doubt today. We know that glaciers definitely cut through quite a bit of North America. One of the ways that we can tell that is when a river will cut a gorge, it actually cuts a V shape. But when those glaciers push through, they actually scrape up sand, boulders, and rocks, and they cut a U-shaped gorge. Now, interestingly, when those glaciers finally melt, they leave what's called till mounds, usually in the shape of a U. It's where the leading edge of that glacier pushed down, it collected all the sand and rocks and boulders, and then when it melted, you have a mound of physical material that was left in its place. Anybody that examines the evidence would be hard-pressed to say, hey, there was no flood, or there was no ice age.
Yeah. When you talk about the Ice Age, what evidence is there that tells us how much of the earth was covered.
A lot of people are under the false assumption that the Ice Age covered the entire planet, and that's not the case. Best estimates we have are roughly in round numbers that it covered 1/3. And there again, you can look at glacial tracts, you can look at where these till mounds were. So we know, for instance, that it didn't cover the entire Earth. Obviously, if we had an ice age that did, it would be hard to explain exactly how life even survived. If all of the land masses on the planet were completely covered in ice, it's going to be too harsh for plants and animals to make it. So bear in mind, roughly 1/3 of the Earth was covered in this ice age event.
Let's talk about an explanation for the existence of an ice age. What are the factors? What's the recipe for an ice age? What do we need to have happen?
What do you need to have? Well, let's see. You've got to have warmed oceans. Those warmed oceans are going to actually cause increased evaporation. They're going to put more water up into the atmosphere that can then be turned into snow and ice. So we've got to figure out a way to warm up the oceans, but at the same time, we need to cool off the land. With those two things going on, you've got the perfect recipe for an ice age. Now, one of the verses of the Bible that I think explains this best is Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, we're told where the waters for the flood came from. The second part of that verse says, "On that great day, all the fountains of the great deep will be broken up, and the windows of heaven will be opened." Now, if you take the first section of that, the fountains of the great deep broken up, the word's broken up, obviously, it tells me that God was probably tearing apart tectonic plates, that he was literally tearing apart landmass. Another part not to miss in that particular section of the verse is the great deep. You know, in geology, we learn as we progress towards the mantle of the earth, as we progress towards that core, things heat up. It gets hotter as you go down. So we've got land masses being torn apart in the great deep. That tells me that we're going to have some lava flow, that we're going to have volcanoes going off literally all over. You know, Eddie, when Mount St. Helens erupted, it put ash into the atmosphere that was seen 4 states away. Now think about a volcanic explosion that is taking place simultaneously in the oceans and on all of the continents. We're not talking just 1 or 2 volcanoes. We're talking about literally hundreds all over the planet. What have you done? Well, let's see. You've warmed up the oceans with that lava. You've put ash up into the atmosphere that's going to block out the sun's rays that are going to cool the land. And so suddenly, just with that one verse, we have the recipe for an ice age. An ice age that we believe probably lasted for 350, 400 years after the flood.
So with all of those conditions being explained by the flood conditions and all those other things associated with it, the fountains of the great deep and all of that, one of the things that does is it helps us to see that perhaps the perception that we've left, at least a perception I had growing up, that, you know, when the flood came, you know, there were a few clouds in the air that just dropped a little spring shower, and you know, and somehow from that, you know, you cover the whole earth, and it was more than that. You know, you've got the windows of heaven open, and this water coming down, as well as from the depths of the earth.
That's right. Coming
up too.
Yes.
And you might talk a little bit about the waters that came down from the heavens.
You know, the text talks about the windows of heaven being open, and we feel like that's probably, if you go back and look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, Moses talks about there being waters above and below a firmament. Check the text, see what your Bible says. If you were to ask yourself, what does that word firmament mean? It actually comes from the Hebrew word rakia, which means an expanse or the heavens. So we have Moses, he's describing waters above this firmament and below this firmament. Now, most of us today, even here in Texas, would know what waters below the firmament are. We have lakes and rivers and streams and oceans. But what is he talking about when he talks about waters above that firmament? We believe that that's a pretty good biblical indication that there was at one time either ice crystals or water vapor around the earth, and when God opened up those windows of heaven, that was the ultimate collapse of that canopy. You know, you mentioned another good point. A lot of times students are asked about or quizzed about on test the concept of Pangea. Pangea is simply the term that is given for a period of time where there was allegedly a supercontinent, where all the land masses were put together as one. Now, if you were to look at South America and Africa, if you were to cut those out of a map, hand them to a small child, it looks like puzzle pieces that could fit together. One of the things that we need to bear in mind is, while we don't know yet today if that's the case, it's not going to affect our faith one way or the other. If we wake up in the morning and they prove definitely, yes, there was one supercontinent, or no, there wasn't, that's not going to change whether or not God exists and whether or not He sent His Son. The problem with the whole idea of Pangea is they're using uniformity in order to teach our kids millions of years, and here's how they do it. They look at the globe and they say, South America is actually moving away from Africa at a very small millimeter rate every so often. So we can measure. And what they do is extrapolate backwards, and they say, oh, if it was only moving just a few millimeters, then it must have taken millions of years for that to have occurred. The problem is they're assuming that it has been moving at that same rate the entire time. Somebody needs to ask the question, is it possible that when God tore apart those tectonic plates, when He let loose His fury on a sin-sick world, could things have been torn apart very quickly, those continents moving very rapidly, and we're just now seeing the settling rate of those continents? The answer is yes. You know, when you look at the destruction of a global flood, is it possible that South America moved at a much faster rate away from Africa for maybe many months, maybe even a few years, and we're just now seeing it slow down and kind of settle into the position that we see it today? I think the answer is yes.
We've been talking about the flood and catastrophism and things like that. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because you know the atheists, the evolutionists, when they are pressed on this issue about catastrophism and how the biblical flood would fit, you know, of all things, would fit in the category of catastrophe. But they're very quick to attack the biblical account and say, well, you know, all the things that the Bible says about the flood could not have happened. You couldn't get all those animals in that boat.
Right.
You know, the boat itself, you know,
wouldn't be big enough.
Exactly, all of that. So spend a few minutes talking about those kinds of matters.
Let's start with a Bible verse that we should not use on this topic of Pangea. If you look in Genesis chapter 10, the Bible speaks in verse 25. It says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Now, a lot of people will use that Bible verse and they'll say, hey, look, the Bible talks about this idea of Pangea, of everything dividing, and yet that division that is spoken thereof in Genesis chapter 10 is talking about a division of people. And so it's, you know, when we try to defend what we see in nature, let's make sure that we use things in good context, because that would give the scientists good artillery against God's Word when we take things out of context. As far as the flood, a lot of people are trying to say, hey, it's not scientifically accurate. There's no way that a man could build a boat that big. And yet lots and lots of studies have been done. In fact, let me encourage you, there's a book out called A Feasibility Study written by John Woodmorappy. In his book, he showed how just 8 people using 10-hour days could have cared for, watered, and cleaned up after all of the animals. Now, realize he is taking into account regular working days with animals who are all living, eating. He's not even taking into account the fact that God may have put these animals into a state of hibernation, We've done other studies where we've looked at the size of this boat. Now, oftentimes we think of this boat as just a small little vessel, and we try to squeeze all of the different species on there. But bear in mind, the Bible doesn't say that Noah had to take 2 of every species. It specifically talks about 2 of each kind of animal. And somebody says, well, you're just splitting hairs. Think about this. Did Noah have to take 2 golden retrievers, 2 Labrador retrievers, 2 German shepherds, 2 coyotes, 2 wolves, 2 dingoes, or could he have taken 2 of the dog kind? Secondly, when you actually do the measurements, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 15, we're given the dimensions of the boat. And in fact, the very next verse, it tells us he was to put 3 decks on it. So we recognize the fact we can calculate volume. And we've done that, and I can tell you, using a very conservative estimate of a 17.5-inch cubit, a cubit being a measure of a man's forearm, that boat would have had 1.39 million cubic feet of storage space. Since that number is really too big for any of us to get our hands around, a better way to look at it is if we were to compare the storage area of the ark to boxcars on a train. Do you realize Noah's Ark could have held 522 railroad boxcars? Folks, you see, this wasn't some little Sunday afternoon sailing ship. This was the largest boat built to that day. Now, the question should be asked, who created the animals? God did. Don't you think he can get the calculations right for how big a boat he needs for the animals he created? Another factor to think about, did Noah have to take adult-sized animals on that boat? Now, oftentimes
we assume that.
We have pictures in our mind of all the... But the actual purpose of those animals was for reproduction afterwards. Now think with me, does it make sense, no offense intended to anybody over the age of 50, but does it make sense to take senior citizen animals on board the ark knowing afterwards their primary purpose is for reproducing and multiplying and to filling the earth? Or does it make sense of taking smaller juvenile animals that would eat less food, take up less space, produce less waste? You see, when you really analyze this thing scientifically, you recognize that yes, a man named Noah could have cut, dressed, and installed just enough lumber. In fact, the best estimate I've seen is in 81 years, leaving him and his sons plenty of time to pitch that boat within and without pitch. The measurements are perfect, according to God, to fit all of the animals necessary to keep this earth the way that we find it today. He was to take 2 of every unclean, 7 pair of the clean. Somebody says, well, what were the clean for? One of the first things that Noah did when he got off that boat was to build an altar. And those clean animals were then obviously used for sacrificing. So the size was big enough. We just talked a little bit about where the waters came from, the fountains of the great deep, the windows of heaven. When you really add it all up, when you look at scientifically speaking, the ratio and the amount of time that he had, according to the Bible, Noah had roughly 100 years to build a boat that big. You start to realize that, hey, this thing is not only scientifically feasible, the evidence points out that it really happened.
Brad, once again, we thank you for being with us today and enlightening us on a lot of these scientific matters. It certainly gives us a lot to think about, and there's a lot out there to study. Yeah. And covering the Grand Canyon, there's, like you said, there's a lot of information out there with regard to that.
And our kids really need to think about the worldview they're developing and make sure that what they read in their textbooks really harmonizes with the Bible.
That's right. And perhaps we can talk about that worldview a little later. But we're out of time today, but don't go anywhere just yet, because I'm going to be right back in a moment with a free offer.
Speech on. Timer. Button. Selected. Screen record.